The cold metal of my badge felt like a block of ice against my chest as I realized that the man standing 3 feet away from me, wearing the exact same uniform, was not a police officer. I had been on the force for 12 years, and I knew every face in the 3rd precinct. But this man was a stranger who had walked right into a secure crime scene and started collecting evidence in a yellow plastic bag. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up because I realized he wasn't just a trespasser. He was the person we were looking for, and he was currently holding the only weapon that could link him to the murder. It was nearly midnight at the old shipyard, a place where the salt air rots everything it touches and the fog rolls in so thick that you can barely see your own boots on the ground. I was supposed to be waiting for my partner, Miller, to bring the transport van, but the radio had gone dead 5 minutes ago, leaving me in total darkness except for the flickering yellow beam of my flashlight. I watched the imposter move with a calculated, rhythmic precision, his gloved hands reaching into the bloodied trunk of the abandoned sedan to retrieve a small, silver object that glinted in the moonlight. I knew I had to act, but my holster felt miles away, and every time I shifted my weight, the rusted metal floorboards beneath me groaned like a dying animal. How had he known exactly which frequency we were using for the perimeter? And why was there a second police cruiser parked behind the crates with its lights off and no one inside? I felt a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead as the man stopped moving and tilted his head to the side, listening to the same silence that was currently screaming in my ears. He didn't turn around yet, but I could see the silhouette of his hand dropping down to his belt, where a heavy, non-regulation blade was tucked into a leather sheath. The realization hit me then that Miller wasn't just late. He was likely the reason this man had been able to walk past the yellow tape without a single word being spoken over the airwaves. I took a slow, agonizing step backward, trying to melt into the shadows of the shipping containers, but the heel of my boot caught on a discarded heavy chain. The metal clattered against the concrete with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the dead of the night, and the imposter spun around with a speed that didn't seem human. His face was a mask of cold, focused aggression, and I saw that he wasn't wearing a real badge at all, but a cheap, painted piece of tin that caught the light just enough to look convincing from a distance. He didn't say a word, which was the most terrifying part, because it meant he wasn't interested in negotiating or explaining his way out of the situation. I turned and bolted toward the pier, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as I heard the heavy thud of his boots gaining on me with every passing second. The shipyard was a labyrinth of rusted steel and rotten wood, and I knew that if I stayed on the main path, he would have me pinned against the water within a minute. I dove between 2 towering stacks of lumber, the splinters catching on my uniform, and pressed my back against the rough wood while I tried to steady my shaking hands enough to draw my service weapon. Why was my holster empty? And when exactly had I been disarmed without even noticing the weight was gone from my hip? The panic began to rise in my throat like bile as I felt the empty leather of my belt, realizing that the collision I had with a supposed witness at the entrance had been the moment he swiped my gun. Now, I was a police officer being hunted by a killer who was using my own department's gear and my own weapon to finish the job. I could hear him walking slowly now, the sound of his footsteps deliberate and mocking, as if he knew I was trapped in this narrow alleyway of wood and iron. He began to whistle a low, off-key tune that echoed off the metal containers, creating a haunting wall of sound that made it impossible to tell exactly which direction he was coming from. I looked up and saw a rusted fire escape dangling from the side of a nearby warehouse, the bottom rung just out of reach of an average person's jump. I knew that if I made a noise now, he would be on me before I could climb, but if I stayed here, he would find me as soon as he turned the corner of the lumber pile. The fog was getting even thicker, smelling of oil and old fish, and it began to wrap around the shipyard like a burial shroud, cutting off my view of the streetlights in the distance. I waited for the whistle to fade toward the left, and then I lunged for the ladder, my fingers gripping the cold, slimy metal as I pulled myself up with a strength born of pure, unadulterated terror. Just as my boots cleared the ground, I felt a hand grab my ankle with a grip like a vice, pulling me back toward the darkness below. I kicked out blindly, my heavy-duty boot connecting with something soft, and I heard a grunt of pain followed by the sound of a heavy object hitting the gravel. I didn't look back to see if it was my gun or his knife. I just climbed, my muscles screaming and my lungs burning as I reached the first landing of the metal stairs. Below me, I could see the shadow of the man standing still, looking up at me with eyes that seemed to reflect no light at all, as if he were a ghost made of nothing but malice and stolen authority. I scrambled through a broken window into the warehouse, the glass cutting into my palms, and I found myself in a cavernous room filled with the skeletons of old boats. The air was even colder in here, and the only light came from the moon shining through the holes in the corrugated tin roof, creating long, jagged stripes of light and shadow across the floor. I knew I couldn't stay in the open, so I crawled into the hull of a half-finished yacht, pulling a heavy canvas tarp over myself and holding my breath until my chest felt like it was going to explode. I heard the fire escape groan as he began to climb, the slow, rhythmic clank of metal against metal telling me exactly how much time I had left to live. Every sense I had was heightened to a painful degree, and I could hear the tiny scratch of a mouse in the corner and the distant sound of a foghorn out at sea. The warehouse door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and the beam of a flashlight began to sweep across the room, the light passing over the canvas tarp several times. I prayed that the blood on my hands hadn't dripped onto the floor, and I closed my eyes tight, trying to visualize a way out of this nightmare that didn't end in a shallow grave. The footsteps moved closer, stopping right beside the boat, and I could hear his heavy breathing just inches away from my hiding spot. Then, the most beautiful sound in the world broke the silence, the distant, wailing siren of a dozen police cruisers screaming toward the shipyard. Miller must have regained consciousness or managed to trigger the silent alarm in the transport van, because the shipyard was suddenly flooded with the blue and red flashes of emergency lights. The man beside the boat froze, his flashlight flicking off instantly, and I heard him move toward the back exit with a frantic, desperate speed. I didn't wait for him to leave. I threw off the tarp and screamed for help with every bit of air left in my lungs, the sound echoing through the warehouse until the first team of real officers burst through the doors. They found me shivering in the hull of that boat, my hands stained with grease and blood, but I was alive and the imposter was gone into the night. We found my service weapon discarded near the fire escape, but the silver object he had taken from the crime scene was nowhere to be found. Even now, months later, I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear that low, off-key whistle coming from the hallway of my own home. I still wonder who that man was and how many other precincts he has walked into, wearing a stolen face and a badge that no one thought to question. The fluorescent lights in the evidence locker hummed with a low, buzzing sound that always made me feel like I was trapped inside a giant, dying insect. I had been working the late shift at the downtown precinct for 3 years, and I usually enjoyed the sterile, quiet solitude of organizing the fragments of broken lives that ended up in cardboard boxes. But tonight, as I scanned the manifest for case 88 Bravo, a cold realization began to sink into my chest like a heavy stone. The locker door for the high-priority cartel evidence was standing a fraction of an inch open, and the heavy-duty magnetic seal, which should have required my biometric thumbprint to release, was dead and dark. I pulled my radio from my belt to call for security, but when I pressed the button, all I heard was the hollow, static hiss of a jammed frequency. My heart began to thud against my ribs with a slow, heavy rhythm as I looked up at the security camera in the corner of the room. The little red light was blinking, but the lens was tilted just a few degrees too high, focused on the ceiling instead of the rows of steel shelves. Someone had not only bypassed the most expensive security system in the city, but they had done it with the kind of insider knowledge that suggested they were still standing in the building with me. I stepped closer to the locker, my breath catching in my throat as I saw that the large vacuum-sealed bag containing the encrypted hard drives and the ledger was gone. This wasn't a simple theft. This was the destruction of a decade-long investigation into the most dangerous criminal organization in the state. Why had the silent alarm at the front desk not been triggered? And why was the heavy steel door to the evidence wing now locking itself with a mechanical click that echoed through the empty hallway? I rushed to the door and pulled on the handle, but it was deadlocked from the outside, turning the most secure room in the precinct into a high-tech cage. I retreated back into the maze of shelves, my boots making no sound on the polished concrete as I searched for anything I could use to defend myself. I wasn't an officer. I was a forensics technician, and the only thing I had on my belt was a multi-tool and a heavy flashlight. I heard a faint, metallic scraping sound coming from the ventilation duct above the back corner of the room, followed by the soft thud of someone landing on their feet. I dived behind a stack of crates labeled "Found Property," pressing my back against the cold wood while I tried to control my frantic, shallow breathing. A shadow began to stretch across the floor, long and distorted by the overhead lights, and I saw the outline of a man wearing a tactical vest and a balaclava. He wasn't moving like a common thief. He moved with the disciplined, lethal grace of someone who had spent years in uniform. He held a silenced pistol in his right hand, the barrel sweeping the room with a professional precision that told me he wasn't here to leave any witnesses behind. I realized then that the rat we had been looking for in the department wasn't just a rumor. He was currently 5 feet away from me, and he knew exactly where the blind spots in the cameras were. He stopped near the crate where I was hiding, and I could hear the faint rustle of his gear as he reached into his pocket to retrieve a burner phone. "The package is secure, but the tech is still inside the room," he whispered, his voice muffled by the mask but carrying a chilling, familiar cadence. "I'm going to clean up the site now, so make sure the back gate is open for my exit in 2 minutes." My blood turned to ice as I recognized the voice of Detective Vance, the man who had sat across from me in the break room just 4 hours ago, complaining about the quality of the coffee. I knew that if I stayed hidden, he would eventually find me when he did a final sweep of the room before leaving. I looked around the shelf and saw a heavy canister of forensic dusting powder sitting on a cart just a few feet away. It was a long shot, but it was the only thing I had that could create a distraction in this windowless tomb. I reached out, my fingers trembling so hard I almost knocked over a box of shell casings, and I grabbed the canister by its handle. As Vance turned his back to check the lock on the main door, I stood up and threw the canister with every bit of strength I possessed. It hit the concrete floor and burst, sending a massive, blinding cloud of fine white powder into the air, filling the immediate area with a thick, choking haze. Vance spun around and fired 2 shots into the cloud, the muffled thud-thud of the suppressed weapon hitting the crates behind me, but I was already moving toward the back of the room. I scrambled up a set of rolling stairs and used the weight of my flashlight to smash the glass on the emergency fire suppression pull station. The alarm didn't sound because the wiring had been cut, but the mechanical release for the overhead sprinklers was still functional. A split second later, the room was flooded with a torrential downpour of cold water, turning the forensic powder into a slippery, gray sludge that coated the floor and the lenses of Vance's tactical goggles. He stumbled, cursing under his breath as he tried to wipe the grime from his face, and I used that moment to sprint toward the heavy loading elevator at the back of the wing. This elevator was used for moving large crates of seized vehicles and heavy equipment, and it operated on a separate manual hydraulic system that couldn't be hacked by a computer. I threw myself inside the metal cage and slammed the up button, the old engine groaning as the platform began to rise with agonizing slowness. Vance saw the movement and fired again, a bullet whistling past my ear and embedding itself in the wooden floor of the elevator, but the metal gate was already closing. I watched his masked face disappear as the floor rose toward the garage level, and I didn't stop running until I burst out into the rainy night of the precinct parking lot. I didn't go to my car, knowing he would expect that. Instead, I ran straight toward the brightly lit 24-hour diner across the street, which was filled with late-night construction workers and witnesses. I collapsed into a booth, my clothes soaked and my skin covered in white powder, and I used the diner's landline to call the chief of police directly on his private number. 10 minutes later, the parking lot was swarmed by a different tactical team, one that I knew hadn't been compromised. They found the evidence locker empty and the ventilation duct open, but Vance was nowhere to be found, having vanished into the city's underground tunnels before the perimeter could be set. I still have to go into work every day, and I still have to walk past that evidence locker, but I never do it alone anymore. Every time I hear the ventilation system kick on or see a shadow move in the corner of my eye, I wonder if he is still out there, watching the cameras he helped install. I know he is waiting for the right moment to come back for the one piece of evidence he couldn't destroy that night, the person who saw his face and lived to tell the story. The walls of my apartment are thin enough that I can usually hear my neighbor, Mr. Henderson, watching his late-night news programs, but tonight, the silence was broken by a sound so violent that it made my heart stop in my chest. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of a battering ram hitting a door, followed immediately by the splintering of wood and the shouting of deep, aggressive voices. "Police! Search warrant! Get on the ground now!" echoed through the hallway, and I felt a wave of relief for a split second, thinking that the authorities were finally handling the suspicious activity I had noticed in the building. But as I peered through the tiny glass peephole of my own door, the relief turned into a cold, paralyzing terror that made my blood run thin. The men in the hallway were dressed in tactical gear with "police" printed in bold white letters across their chests, but they weren't moving like any officers I had ever seen in the movies or on the news. Their movements were jagged and uncoordinated, and one of them was wearing muddy hiking boots instead of the standard-issue black tactical footwear. Most terrifyingly, the man leading the stack had a tattoo of a coiled viper snaking up his neck, a mark that would never be allowed in our local department. I realized with a jolt of adrenaline that these weren't officers at all. They were professionals of a different kind, using the guise of a raid to bypass the building security and enter the apartment next door. Why had they looked at my door and hesitated, and did the man with the viper tattoo just see the light from my hallway reflecting in my eye through the peephole? I backed away from the door as slowly as humanly possible, my bare feet making no sound on the cold hardwood floor, but then I heard it, the heavy metallic scrape of a crowbar sliding into the frame of my own door. They weren't just here for the neighbor. They were clearing the entire floor to ensure there were no witnesses left to call the real 911. I looked around my small studio apartment, my mind racing through a list of hiding spots, but everything seemed too obvious, too flimsy to stop a group of armed men. I remembered the narrow crawl space behind the kitchen pantry, a cramped utility area where the water heater sat, and I scrambled toward it just as the first blow landed on my front door. I pulled the pantry door shut behind me and squeezed into the tiny, dark gap between the wall and the heavy metal tank, my knees pressing against my chin. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old insulation, making it nearly impossible to breathe without coughing. I reached into my pocket and realized with a surge of panic that my phone was still sitting on the nightstand, its screen probably glowing bright blue against the darkness of the bedroom. The front door gave way with a sickening crash, the sound of the frame snapping like a dry twig, and I heard the heavy, deliberate footsteps of at least 3 men entering my home. "Clear the kitchen," a voice rasped, sounding like sandpaper on stone, and I heard the sound of cabinet doors being ripped open and plates shattering on the floor. I pressed my hands over my mouth, my fingernails digging into my skin, trying to suppress the sound of my own heartbeat, which felt like a drum echoing in the small crawl space. If they opened the pantry, they would see the false back panel, and there was no lock on my side to keep them out. I heard one of them walk into the bedroom, and a few seconds later, the muffled sound of my phone being smashed against the floor echoed through the apartment. "He was just here. The bed is still warm," the man shouted, and I heard the sound of furniture being overturned and the closet doors being ripped off their hinges. Why was the man with the viper tattoo suddenly standing right outside the pantry? And why was he humming a low, distorted tune as he ran his blade along the wooden slats of the door? I could see the faint flicker of his flashlight through the cracks in the wood, the beam dancing across the floor just inches from where I was huddled. My lungs were screaming for a full breath of air, but the dust was tickling the back of my throat, forcing me to swallow repeatedly to keep from making a sound. The man reached for the pantry handle, and I heard the slow, agonizing creak of the hinges as he swung it open. He started tossing boxes of cereal and cans of soup onto the floor, his movements casual and bored, as if he were shopping for groceries instead of hunting a human being. His hand brushed against the false back panel, and I felt the wood vibrate against my spine, a sensation that made my skin crawl with the proximity of death. Suddenly, a loud, piercing whistle came from the hallway, followed by the sound of a heavy radio transmission that wasn't coming from the intruder's gear. "We've got a patrol car pulling into the lot. Move out. Now!" Someone yelled from the front door, and the man in the pantry froze, his hand still resting on the wood just inches from my head. I held my breath until my vision began to swim with dark spots, praying that the local patrol officer was just doing a routine check or responding to the noise of the first door being kicked in. The intruder didn't move for what felt like an eternity, his breathing heavy and frustrated, before he finally slammed the pantry door shut with a force that made the water heater rattle. I heard them sprinting out of the apartment, their heavy boots thudding down the hallway as they fled through the fire exit at the end of the building. I stayed in that crawl space for nearly 20 minutes, paralyzed by the fear that it was a trick and they were waiting for me to emerge so they could finish the job. When I finally crawled out, my limbs were stiff and my clothes were covered in gray insulation, but the sight of the real blue and red lights flashing against my ceiling was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I stumbled toward the window and saw the local police swarming the parking lot, their real badges glinting under the streetlights and their movements organized and professional. I learned later that the man with the viper tattoo was part of a crew that specialized in tactical robberies, using the fear of the law to keep victims from fighting back. I moved out of that apartment the very next day, and I never leave my phone on the nightstand anymore. Every time I hear a heavy knock on a door or a loud voice in a hallway, I feel that cold crawl of the insulation on my skin and the shadow of the viper on the wall. I know that the real danger isn't always the person who looks like a criminal. Sometimes the most terrifying thing in the world is the person wearing a uniform that they have no right to touch.